Hi everyone, Nick here, speaking for the Dungeons & Drama Nerds team. Last week was a particularly hard week. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and, in the US, Governor Abbott's virulently transphobic order to state welfare agencies in Texas are weighing heavily on us. If you have the means, we'd ask that you do what you can to aid the people of Ukraine and support trans rights everywhere. In the show notes for this episode, you'll find links to places you can donate. The organizations supporting Ukraine include the Red Cross in Ukraine, the local medical organization Hospitalers, and Save Life in UA. This list was shared with us by Romana Isabella, a podcast regular who's based in Kiev. The organizations to donate to in support of trans youth include Lambda Legal and more Texas-specific organizations, including the Transgender Education Network of Texas and Organización Latina Trans Tejas. Please donate if you're able, and if you can, take the time to write to your local representatives to let them know you support trans rights and the people of Ukraine. Thanks so much. And now, on with our show.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds.
Hello, and welcome to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. My name is Percy, and today I'm joined by Nick.
Hey there.
And Todd.
Hiya.
We will be discussing How to Play Lancer by Miguel Lopez and Tom Parkinson Morgan, and published by Massive Press. Lancer is a far-future TTRPG about huge fighting mechs and the people who pilot them. The setting of Lancer features a post-Anthropocene world in which humanity has spread to the stars, and mech pilots known as Lancers do battle with both human foes and unknowable entities. Lancer features a streamlined set of social rules, engaging tactical combat, and extraordinarily customizable options for mechs.
Yeah, so let's kick it off with some of the unique aspects of this system. Percy, as you said, there's kind of streamlined social rules for pilots and then very crunchy mecha customization for combat. You hop back and forth between freeform narrative play and Mech Combat, which is very, very structured. Campaigns are often structured as missions and downtime, and within both periods, play happens in scenes, which could be a conversation between pilots, a combat encounter, a montage of downtime activities, or any other discrete unit of continuous dialogue between players. In social play, when characters are asked to do a skill check, they roll a flat d20. On most rolls, successes are any number 10 or higher. Pilots also, once they're created and then on level up, get a certain number of triggers. These might be things like getting a hold of something, showing off, staying cool, or word on the street. If an action a player wants to do aligns with a trigger they have, they automatically add +2 to their roll, and then on level ups, that could become a +4, +6, etc. So it becomes like much easier to do the sort of things that you're good at doing. Combat in narrative play isn't turn-based. Players always have the opportunity to act first in this phase of play. And like if you, let's say, get in a fight in a bar as pilots, the GM doesn't roll any dice against you. What the other characters do is dependent on your own dice rolls. So if you roll a really sweet punch on someone, you might knock them out. If you go to punch someone and you totally whiff, they might hit you back in the face. It's that kind of thing, which I think is really nice in terms of narrative play and failing forward.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about the triggers is that it really is... this game feels a lot like a D20 fantasy game to me, in that parts of it are very, very crunchy, but the social triggers are pretty broad, like much broader than, say, D&D's skills, I feel like. And also, you can make up your own if you want. There's a whole, it's all the ones they offer, like show off or stay cool. And then there's, also just talk to your GM if you want one of your triggers to be like good at diving or something. I don't know why you'd want that, but like maybe you want to make a diver mech who can like explore underwater by themselves.
My trigger is explore the seas.
Hold your breath real good.
my trigger is hunt the white whale. Anyway, but the other half of the game is way crunchier and way more tactical and like focused, and this is where you can really get into the tactical character customization options that some tabletop games can offer you. I think this is probably the crunchiest game we've had on the show so far. Mm-hmm. And that other half of the game is the Mech Combat. So you're going through your pilot's life as normal in social life. If you have to hop in your mech and fight something, you can switch into this much more tactical mech combat system. Now in Lancer, there are no classes, but each mech is extremely modular. So you can create an incredibly specific customized mech that does exactly what you want it to. There are no classes, but I should say each mech kind of frame past the basic one is classified as one of 5 roles. Those are artillery, defender, striker, support, and controller. And if you've ever played an MMO, you probably recognize these terms because they're common in a lot of games. Like the defender is good defending people. The striker is really good at getting in the mix and dealing damage. Mm-hmm. In order to keep players from being too overwhelmed by choice right away, all level 0 pilots start with the same GMS Everest frame for their mechs. That mech still offers a lot of customization, and some players actually keep using that basic frame all the way up through the game. They just swap in different gear and weapons. Mm-hmm. If you want to hack your opponent's mech and crash their systems, there's a build for that. If you want to fly around with a cool laser sword, there's a build for that too. If you want to take shots from 20 squares away from behind cover, there's a build for that. And if you want to support your teammates by clearing statuses and stunning enemies, that's another option you can take. In our game, you're specifically going to hear about 4 frames that our players have selected. The Raleigh, which is a striker that is a sort of gunslinger mech, but Todd also wanted a laser sword, so he has a laser sword.
It's great.
There's the Shimano Smith Death's Head, which is a sort of long-range artillery mech. The ISPN Drake, which is an extremely kind of tanky mech. And the Nelson, which is a striker that is very difficult to track, so a kind of fast combat mech. In addition to your mech customizations, you also select 3 pilot talents to start out with. These might give you additional actions or free actions in combat, such as maybe after an attack misses, you're able to move for free. Or you get automatic accuracy on the first ranged attack you do each round. Or you and allies all get soft cover from attacks if you're engaged in combat, in hand-to-hand combat with another mech.
That's one that I took, and I think it's so cool because basically my laser sword is so good at cutting other ranged attacks in half that I provide soft cover by cutting the bullets. Or at least that's how I interpret it.
And that's how your specific mech does it.
Yes.
That's very cool. So in Lancer, there are 3 types of rolls that you will be asked to make. There are skill checks, attacks, and saves, which is familiar to anybody, I think, who has played a D20 system. Skill checks are used to overcome a challenging situation. Attacks are used to make offensive actions in mech combat, and saves are used in mech combat to resist damage or negative effects. Skill checks are mostly for narrative play, but there are a set of rules for if you as your pilot in mech combat are for some reason operating outside of your mech, you're running around just you on the ground. So there are, I think, also opportunities for that kind of thing to come up in mech combat depending on the situation. But it is sort of assumed that your fragile human ? Body will stay within the protection of your mech when you are fighting with laser swords.
I found a new favorite line in the rule book in the section on the actions you can take if you're running around outside of your mech during combat. There's the jockey action, which is basically you, the pilot, try to jump on the foot of another mech to sabotage it. Mm-hmm. And the start of that section reads, when you jockey, you aggressively attack an enemy mech while on foot. It cannot be emphasized enough how foolhardy and dangerous this is.
I concur. But anyway, circling back to types of roles that you can make, the sort of difficulty class system in Lancer operates in a way that I think is maybe a little bit similar to Blades in the Dark in terms of classification of types of roles. So most roles succeed on a 10+. If a role is designated as risky by the GM, it still succeeds on a 10+, but if you roll under 20, there will be some kind of consequence. And heroic level rolls need a 20 or higher to succeed, and you take consequences on anything under a 20. And consequences are defined in the book as like putting yourself in harm's way, taking damage, in some ways sort of getting in a disadvantageous situation or somebody else getting an advantage on you.
Mhm.
If you fail a check, you can't try doing the same thing again unless the narrative circumstances change, which is a thing that I like that they say explicitly, because I feel like this is a thing that a lot of like D&D DMs try to enforce, but it's not in the book. So you still get players who are like, oh, I failed the lockpicking check. Let me continue to try again and again until I roll high enough on my D20. But if you do fail a roll, you can also choose to push it by reattempting the same check as a risky check instead of a regular one, or as a heroic check instead of a risky one. So basically kind of gambling on getting a higher dice roll with much higher stakes.
So we already mentioned this a little bit before, but there's this mechanic that's used a lot in this game, which is accuracy and difficulty. You can kind of think of this the way you might think of advantage or disadvantage in other systems in terms of like how it works, but what it does is very different. So when you're making social checks or combat rolls, you might have accuracy or difficulty depending on those circumstances, but you're not rolling like 2 d20s and taking the higher roll. You would roll 1 d20, and then if you had 1 accuracy, you would roll 1 d6 and then add that result to your d20. Or if it was difficulty, you would subtract it from your d20. There's situations where you might have both accuracy and difficulty at the same time, which I think is interesting. So like maybe you're trying to make a really difficult shot at an enemy mech, but you're a good sniper. You might get +1 accuracy because you're a good sniper, but like +2 difficulty because they're in a hard to spot area. And so those things cancel each other out 1-to-1. So instead of rolling 1 accuracy and adding that and then 2 difficulty and subtracting, you would instead cancel out 1 accuracy, 1 difficulty, and be left with the remainder 1 difficulty. In situations where you have multiple difficulty or multiple accuracy, you don't add them all up to your d20. You just take the highest result and either add or subtract that. So let's say you have 3 difficulty, you would roll 3d6, you would take the highest number of those 3, subtract it from your d20, and that would be your result. So you're never changing by any more than 1 to 6 on any of these rolls, which is also nice for kind of bounding how wild things can get. Pilots also have this stat known as grit, which is kind of like your proficiency bonus. Like it's not exactly a proficiency bonus, but it works in a similar way. Your grit levels up as you level up and get more licenses, and this affects things like attack bonuses, hit points, save targets, all sorts of different things, the way that a proficiency bonus in something like D&D would. Another thing that affects this accuracy and difficulty puzzle is teamwork. Allies can always grant you aid to give you +1 accuracy, but no matter how many of your teammates are trying to help you with a thing, you only ever get 1 accuracy on that. But, and I think that this is a nice trade-off, if you give an ally accuracy and they fail, you take part in that thing going wrong. So like, let's say you're at a bar, your buddy is trying to arm wrestle someone and you want to like give them accuracy, and maybe that's by like stepping on someone's foot. I don't know, whatever. If they fail to pin this person, you would also get in trouble. And I think that that's a narratively interesting thing.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense because aid is so easy to offer. You know, it's just like, yeah, pretty much anyone can help anyone else out as long as it, broadly speaking, makes sense. So yeah, I like that promotion of teamwork. Mm-hmm. If you're getting the impression that the combat in this game is kind of complicated, you're not wrong. There's a lot of different options to consider on your turn, particularly in Mech Combat. In the simplest terms, on your turn, you can, 1, move up to your speed, and then you choose to either take 1 full action or 2 quick actions. That will be your turn, unless you choose to overcharge your mech, which will let you take 1 more quick action at the cost of heating up your mech's reactor core. And if you heat up that reactor core too much, you're going to have a very, very bad time. A full action might look like something like attacking with multiple weapons, kind of launching a barrage, using multiple tech attacks, which is the kind of catch-all term for things like basically trying to hack your opponent's mech and shut it down, stabilizing your mech to clear out some of the conditions affecting it, or if you're up close and personal with somebody and you want to get away without them attacking you, you can use a full action to do that as well. A quick action is going to be your bread and butter. Includes some things that are your bread and butter, like skirmishing with other mechs, just making one attack or one kind of shot, or taking a skill check of any kind of undefined kind. And then there are also some quick actions that we might see if things get hairy, like ejecting from your mech, which is my favorite thing. That they not only have an action to eject from your mech, but they have specific rules. That's like you fly out 6 squares or something like that in, I think, a random direction. Maybe it's not random.
Part of that is so you can overheat your mech if you do, and let it go nuclear, and then you pull the ripcord and bounce.
Yep. So ejecting, and you can also, if you don't want to overheat your mech, you can shut your mech down, kind of do the hard off switch, which is not great in the middle of combat because it takes a full action on your next turn to boot your mech back up, but might be a good idea if, say, your computer systems have been fried by a hacker. In addition to those full actions and quick actions, there's 2 other things that people might be able to do. There are reactions, which are basically special actions that they can use on other people's turns. Everybody has access to the basic reactions brace, which lets them kind of grit to take a hit. And Overwatch, which is, if you've played a D20 fantasy game, basically the equivalent of an attack of opportunity. If you have a defined threat zone, and if an enemy moves around in that threat zone, you get to take a free shot or swipe at them. Like I mentioned earlier, players can choose to overcharge their mech to get an extra quick action, and that scales up the heat in your reactor core. The more times you do it, it starts out just being 1 heat, and that becomes 1d3 heat, and then 1d6, and eventually 1d6 plus 4, which is really a lot, and likely to make your mech melt down. One thing that was initially a little bit difficult to track when I was reading through this book is that there's a couple of different sort of health pools to the mechs, and in both cases there's pretty much there's a quickly diminishing one, and then there's a serious one. This is easiest to explain with the hit points, but in the physical realm there's hit points versus structure damage, and then in the reactor realm there's your heat cap versus stress. So just to use the hit point example, mechs usually have a pool of 10 plus hit points, and they have 4 structure points. When your hit points go down to 0, you take 1 structure damage and you roll a check with a number of d6 equal to the number of structure points you have marked. The lower your result, and you use the lowest result if you're rolling multiple d6s, the worse your mech is damaged, and you're going to take a penalty on your next turn for the rest of the scene, or if you roll a 1, possibly for the rest of the fight. If you roll multiple 1s because you've got multiple structure boxes marked, it's a crushing hit, and your mech is completely destroyed. With heat cap and stress, there's a similar table which follows how your mech is dealing with the stress of combat, being hacked, and being pushed to its limits.
We're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about the setting of Lancer, which is, I think, a really sort of important and unique element of this game as you sort of marry these 2 very different sides, the sort of freeform social play and the narrative, the sort of mech combat, crunchy fight system. So yeah, let's talk about Lancer's setting. Lancer is set in the far-flung future where, in the words of the game's writers, quote, humanity is at once in a state of utopia and working to affect it. Humanity's civilizations inhabit many star systems. In the relatively recent past, Union has created a post-scarcity society for the central systems near Cradle, which is ancient Earth. Incredible advancements have taken place. Many people walk around with their own low-level AIs called companion concierges or compcons. The OmniNet is interconnected on many planets. Ships can travel incredible distances via a network of blink gates, and the best pilots in the world climb into the cockpits of their own mechas. These are Lancers. But in the Rim, there's still strife. Outer planets struggle under the remains of the Second Committee, dormant machine minds are waking up, the vestiges of thousand-year-old wars rumble, and, to borrow the writer's words, this is why we still fight. So this is a really sort of explicitly a world that is reckoning a lot with like colonization and capitalism and all of these things as they're implicated in a world where like there's AIs, there's non-human people, there's like aliens, there's all of these sort of other things that are complicating these things that we are still kind of talking about in our everyday lives.
As a slight note, there aren't aliens.
I'm sorry.
Which they're very specific about. But there's like humans, and then there's these very advanced, sometimes machine minds, which people are mostly very freaked out about.
For content, there is like the lore section of the book is like 250 pages.
It's great.
So like
it's wild.
It's great. It's very easy to get lost in like in the weeds of this very, very intricate history that they've written, but it is also extremely cool.
It's an enormous history, and then one of the first supplements they released for the game was a setting book, which is just wild to me.
Well, it's a narrative campaign, which does have a setting but has a campaign, and hilariously, spoiler, introduces aliens.
God damn it.
After the whole book is like, there are no aliens. You do not play as an alien. And then in No Room for a Wallflower, the first thing is like, there might be aliens here. Which I find hilarious.
Well, pivoting into something I think related to like the world building of the game that I also think is really interesting that the game does has to do with PC death. So in the book, in terms of like, if your character were to die, you always go what they call down and out first. So you're sort of like, you're knocked out, you're removed from the scene. And there's a system for cloning, which basically sort of assumes that like if your pilot dies, you would be able to sort of like re-enter the game as a clone. And there are a lot of sort of rules about that. But basically the tone of the book is very much like mechs are replaceable and you are less replaceable. But like it sort of prioritizes being able to continue playing with the same character if that's something that you want, which I think is a cool thing that I don't see in a lot of games.
I do enjoy that, much like Paranoia, when you are cloned, sometimes weird shit happens. Some of that in Lancer might be like you receive messages from a force that you cannot see. You might have traumatizing memories from your past lives. That like there's narrative flavor, and there's also some like, whenever this happens, roll a blah blah blah, because it might get weird for you because you have died and come back.
Yeah, but I like that the default is this idea that like you can continue with the same character and keep exploring things unless you would prefer to start it with a new character. Like I think that's just like a unique thing that I haven't seen in a lot of other systems. Like as a general rule, reading through this book, like they explicitly name a lot of things that I think are like commonly accepted ways to approach GMing or ways to approach TTRPGs, but they're like written in the rulebook in a way that I don't see very often, particularly in the way that they talk about the combination of how mechanics are serving the storytelling. Like they've sort of split the game into these two very different feeling phases of play or types of play. But the way that everything is sort of oriented is all sort of in service of like creating a fiction in a way that I think is really, really cool. Like there's the emphasis feels very much like, you know, all of these complicated mechanics are a means of telling stories that just happens to be very tactical and very sort of focused on like how many hexes away are you and like what is the angle of this and like all of these sort of crunchy things to keep track of. But it's all sort of in service of like telling a story in this very specific and unique setting. Like one example of this is that there's a note in the rules that you can always choose to fail a check if you think that's the narratively interesting thing to do, which is like a thing that I think a lot of people do naturally, but to see it like written in the rules that like this is an option available to you, like I think that's very neat.
Yeah, there was something I was reading earlier today that explicitly named, which you sort of assume, but again, it was good to see it like explicitly written out. It was like, I think it was something to do with skill checks, and it was basically like, oh, the player decides, this. If there's any question about whether it would apply, the GM adjudicates it. So yeah, similarly, just like explicitly naming kind of how these things work that a lot of people take for granted, I think is good, especially in a game that's this kind of crunchy and tactical and detailed.
Well, and like we've made a lot of references to how like things that sort of align with D20 games or D&D mechanics. But I also think the way that the triggers work is very like Powered by the Apocalypse in its sort of vibe, in terms of like, oh, I actually don't care. Like, we're not going to roll initiative for this bar fight, or we're not going to roll initiative for when you in narrative play go to assassinate the leader of this other faction or whatever. Like, we're just going to figure it out in play, and the GM is going purely based off of the PC's die rolls.
Something that I also really enjoy about this system in the Mech Combat is that, unlike many of the other systems we've played, particularly the ones that are more wargamey, often when you're in combat, you just like fight until one side has destroyed the other entirely. And in Lancer, they have a bunch of different, what they call sit reps, which is short for like situation report. But sometimes it might be like hold an area for 8 rounds until you can be extracted, or like move some NPCs from like this area to this area within this amount of time, whether that's like 8 rounds or 3 rounds. And sometimes it's like defeat the enemy, and sometimes it's like go and seize a certain area and hold it while reinforcements come. And it's just a different way of thinking about using combat in a narrative fashion, because so much of what I have played in my time has been D&D. I feel like as soon as a battle map comes out, that like there is one way that this will be solved, and it is by my character murdering a bunch of other people, which is not to say that that doesn't happen in Lancer. It does, but it becomes something that can be about other things. Like combat does not need to be about annihilation. It can be about holding an enemy off. It can be about retrieving an asset. It can be about all sorts of things. And I think thinking about combat in those terms is also more interesting narratively.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of the kind of, this is something that lots of people kind of encourage doing. I feel like I've seen that a lot in recent years about D20 games, people saying like, to make your encounters more interesting, make the objective literally anything other than murder everyone in this room, but make it something that's clear and accomplishable. And then all of a sudden the tactics change. Mm-hmm. But this game builds it right into the structure of the game itself and gives you a whole section on the rulebook explaining how to do that, rather than just being like, I don't know, figure it out.
Well, and I think in a game that is so deeply customizable in terms of your options in combat, like I think D&D is very customizable in terms of what you're able to do in combat, but all of the skills are oriented towards kill everybody else, kill everybody on the other side. Whereas in Lancer, I think this really encourages you to make the most of these customization options and like think about like, because you can trust that you will have utility in a variety of situations, or that things will come up where, for example, if you're using the Nelson mech frame, that like being able to sneak around unseen actually might be very, very useful if your victory condition, which is what they call like the objective that the PCs are trying to achieve in a mech combat encounter, is to like go capture something from the enemy fortress or whatever.
A broad definition of unseen there, given that the Nelson is canonically like 18 feet tall or something.
True.
Yeah.
Fair.
I think it's also because your mechs are very replaceable, though you, the pilot, are not. It also encourages you to fight more riskily, like to take big swipes and big risks, because like, yeah, it'll suck if you lose your mech, but in the world of Lancer, you can print a new mech in like a day at many locations.
I think that's so funny that they call it printing, because I'm imagining
I think 3D
like
printing.
No, I know, but I'm imagining like an inkjet printer, and there's just like a gauntlet coming out of it.
It's actually, little known fact about the Lancer universe, all the mechs are actually carefully folded and slotted paper.
They're all paper craft.
Paper components that's like put slot A, to put tab B and slot A. Yeah.
Oh my god. And somehow it turns into a laser sword.
Yeah.
Yep.
It turns into a laser sword. It's great. No, but it's, I think both like changing what the definition of success is in these different sit reps, and also being in a situation where your mech failing can still be a success for you, is very fascinating. Like there's a situation where, ramming an enemy outside of the zone of control that you're trying to hold down, even if it means your mech is going to get throttled, is like both an interesting thing to do and a useful thing for you to do, for your comrades. And then you like pull that eject ripcord and fly back to where you need to be to safety. Like that makes combat so much more interesting to me. I feel like, again, especially in D&D, people are so careful with their PCs because PC death is the worst thing that can happen. Even though, again, it's a system where like there are ghosts and dead things all the time, and like you could go on a fun magical quest to bring your friend back from the dead. But I find that people get really paranoid about how they will handle encounters. And I think this allows you to be both more like flexible and freewheeling with the choices that you're making as things change in your combat encounter.
Yeah, I think this system encourages like creativity and teamwork and tactical thought in a way that is really exciting, in part because that's not the whole game. So I think there is like a lot of freedom to like scratch both like things that a player might want to do, which is like very sort of fiction heavy role play that is not super dependent on dice rolls, and then this like extremely tactical half of the game where you are encouraged to think really strategically and really like get nerdy about how you're customizing things and what kind of laser cannon or whatever you're looking at. Like I know Britt was talking about the Drake's like Leviathan fire cannon, which is like an absolutely bonkers weapon.
I will say, as somebody who loves a good like tactical crunchy RPG, I really want to play Lancer because I like that scratching both itch idea, and it seems to be a system that's really designed with the not quite the let's throw everything at it, but there's a lot of blending of different intentions and aesthetics going on that I feel like is actually really rare, because you've got on the one hand the super streamlined narrative play and the super crunchy mech combat. And then even within the mech combat, it's like, it's a D20 system, but sometimes with dice pools, which is also, I think, pretty rare. Like the advantage, disadvantage, or advantage difficulty mechanic is essentially a dice pool. There's some other mechanic I was just reading about earlier that's also a dice pool, and I can't remember what now. But
well, you roll dice pools in like the structure checks and stuff like that, depending on how much damage you've taken or how much stress you've taken. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just it's really interesting design, and I can see getting really into it.
I think there's something for everybody in it. If you are like a person who really, really loves role playing, getting to play with the triggers, I think is really, really cool because they are so broadly applicable. Like there's a trigger called, I think, patch, which is like, could be like setting a wound or like bandaging someone's wound or doing some kind of like medicine check adjacent thing, but it could also be like applied to other situations. And I think that's really cool. But there's also like if you have a person who misses like AD&D and wants to like calculate, do you pronounce it THAC-O or THAC-0?
I think it's THAC-O.
To hit
THAC-O.
AC0.
Yeah. Because if you're unfamiliar, the way that armor class used to work in like original versions of D&D is like with this table that is like premised on like the type of weapon and like as opposed to like additive, it works like subtractively, and it's very it makes a lot of sense once you understand it, but like you have to like reference a bunch of tables and things like that. So like people who find a lot of joy and pleasure in like figuring out these really fiddly things and like going through tables of different options and like branching trees of like, okay, I rolled this on my structure check, so that means I have to roll on this other thing to figure out like the effect of that and what kind of hit it is and that kind of thing is really cool. So there is like, yeah, something for everybody, whether you like really fiddly crunchy mechanics or not.
One of the things that I think is like cool and fun and weird about these mechs is there's 4 different manufacturers, and each of them has like a different flavor of mech. I know a number of us in our actual play will be playing ISP North Stars, which are these kind of like rugged mechs that come from this mining collective. But there's also like Harrison Army, there's Horus, there's Smith Shimano Corpro, and some of those feel a little bit more like Gundams, and some of those feel a little bit more like Neon Genesis Evangelion mechs. And they're clearly trying to like say, this is the mech game for everyone. Like, if you want to play depressed 14-year-olds who have been forced to combat otherworldly forces, like, you probably want to hop in a Horus, or maybe a Smith Shimano Corpro, and like get in your feelings about this. And if you want to be a bunch of orphans from the colonies, like defending against an uprising of Second Committee, like maybe these are some things. But what's really cool is that you can mix and match all of these things. Like when you level up, you get a new license level that you can apply to like any of these different mechs. You need 2 license levels in a mech to get the frame, but like your first one gets you one of their signature weapons and like a cool thing that you can do. Your third one gets you like their final signature weapon and usually some AI, which is really neat. But like, if we level these characters up more, we're going to start at license level 3. But if we level them up more, I would take my full Raleigh that I have, which is like a Western shooter kind of mech, and then try to get a like really cool energy sword from another one and slap it on there. Because I think that's really interesting. And as someone who grew up watching Zoids, there's something like really cool about like, this mech is the base and I will modify Liger Zero, whatever, for people who don't know what that is. But I will put like the tank stuff on it, or I'm going to put the really agile armor on it, or I'm going to put the energy blades that come out the sides on it for this particular instance. And the fact that you can rebuild your mech all the time is also very cool. It's not like, I've put 18 levels into Ranger, but I kind of want to do magic. And it feels a little late to do the kind of magic that I want to do. Like, you can always change out your license levels on level up. And you can just like, it encourages all of this mixing and matching because there aren't classes per se.
And I have to say, I'm really glad that you all decided to play at license level 3, because I feel like it's a really neat sweet spot where, you know, we get to see some of that customization rather than the game starts you at license level 0, where you do get to customize your mech, but like you don't really have access to any of the like 4 corporations stuff. So I'm excited to see what people have made with their 3 license levels, and whether people are going all in on one build or kind of spreading themselves out a little.
Well, and the world building of the game is so specific that I think, and like it is very clear at the beginning of the like lore section that's just like, you don't have to read all of this to play the game. Like this is here for you to take inspiration from stuff and kind of figure out where your character might fit in this world. But there's so much specificity in like how the world works that I think there is so much opportunity for people to really dig in and be like, okay, cool. I'm going to make a character that's absolutely buck wild, which is what multiple people in our campaign have chosen to do. Spoiler alert. I won't say exactly what it is. You'll see, but
well, and it's a fun like it doesn't quite feel like min-maxing because you don't have stats in the traditional sense. You have points that you spend on your stats, and you get like additional points on level up for different stuff. So like I've made my person very speedy just because I was interested in something that could like get around fast, dodge things, and be the quickest gun in the West. Like that's what I'm interested in. So that's what I built. And I'm sure people could build like a very balanced mech that would be good at everything. But apparently we did like a trial combat, and I am very susceptible to tech attacks, which I didn't really think about when I put 5 points in agility. But like those are the choices I made, and those are the choices I'm going to live with as we go through this campaign,
Speedy
which I'm
and
excited
hackable.
about. Yeah, speedy and easily shut down. But I think that's interesting, and I also think it's interesting to experience those things in real time. Like I am going to find the foibles of my build in combat. But it offers me the chance to retune whenever we, have a rest and rebuild our mechs. And I think that that's like cool and interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't have the problem with a lot of crunchy systems where like you invest in a build and you're stuck in that unless your GM is like, you can actually walk that back and we can figure out a way narratively that it works. But like rules as written in this game, it is extremely flexible and customizable, and it allows for evolution in terms of like what your crew of Lancers is doing and what they are trying to do narratively, and lets you sort of build to serve that story and how it evolves. And that ultimately feels like a lot of the reason for a lot of the mechanics, which I think is really cool because it sort of marries those two things together in a way that a lot of people I think view as very like opposed and binary.
Well, a thing I think is great design that like inspires that the like customizing and playing aspect of the game is that if you play a long campaign of Lancer, your pilot license level can go up to 12. But every individual mech's license is only 1 to 3. So you're going to like, not only can you diversify, you will diversify because there's enough that you can take 4 full like suites of abilities. So the like raw power gap is not that huge between like what you start out with and the level 3 stuff. Instead, it's all about finding like synergies and fun different toys horizontally between the different like mechs and different pieces, because it's not like in D&D where it's like, oh, a level 1 character can do 1d6 damage and a level 20 character can do 2d12 plus 172. Like it's not that the numbers grow that enormous. It's about you finding kind of like synergies and combos and like cool ways for things to interact with each other as your options expand.
I mean, you know what it reminds me of actually is Magic the Gathering, because I think...
Tell me more.
Well, I think there are like two schools of thought when it comes to Magic the Gathering. If you're playing in like a serious committed way, one of which is like the people who are like, I'm going to make the most like optimized, like I'm going to go really all in on one thing and be really, really good at that thing. Like I'm going to make my green aggro trample deck and that's my thing. And then there are people who thrive on like finding all of the weird combinations and all of the weird like ways that things interact with each other and exploiting those and playing with those. And I think the way that like the different types of mech interact allow you to sort of build a team that is like exploiting all of these weird things and interacting with things in a sort of weird way. And I really, really particularly like the options for battlefield control that are like a marriage of like a D&D cleric and like blue Magic the Gathering style play. Like I think that's very, very cool. And it feels, I don't know. That's what it makes me think of is Magic the Gathering, but also
for the uninitiated, blue magic is often counter spells.
Yeah, it's lots of counter spells and like, oh, just kidding, you can't do that, or mill through your whole deck.
It's a lot of saying no to other people.
I was gonna say it's denial.
For context, also, I'm a very dedicated blue Magic the Gathering player.
I played Magic the Gathering online for a hot second, and then I was like, this game is very challenging.
But I think it has a lot of kinship with the way that Lancer is, because it is like a thing that there is a high sort of barrier to entry in terms of learning what all of the things mean and what all of the options are. Mm-hmm. But also after you hit that point, it is extremely customizable and extremely like, you just have to go in and say, I know what I would like to do. And there is a combination of things that will allow you to do that exact thing. Yeah, although there's no narrative component to Magic the Gathering, unless you care to read like all of the books.
Should we wrap this up?
Yeah, you can join us next week for our first episode of the actual play of Lancer, and you can meet our Buckwild crew. So we'll see you then. Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percival Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.